Okay, now it's on. Okay. Recording can deter manipulative tactics by investigators and frivolous claims of coercion by defendants. I told you the situation that my son was in. He woke this kid up that was stoned on the grass in front of the school. Woke him up by tapping his bottom of his foot. The kid wanted to charge him with assault. and he tried to claim that he bruised his shins when he touched him on the bottom of the foot. I don't know how he would bruise somebody's shins. Anyway, they had videotape of it. And of course, the parents came in, the mother, that was the father. The mother came in, and when she saw him tap her son, her delicate prints on his son on the bottom of the feet, she said, "Oh, look, he's hitting him, he's hitting him." And of course, the principal just burst out laughing. They actually called the cops in to review the tape. The police looked at the tape and said, "This is ridiculous," of course, and they tried to create an incident that shouldn't have happened. A handful of states require videotaping, and a growing number of jurisdictions voluntarily record interrogations. New York City is this way. They record all their interrogations. The larger jurisdictions, the ones that can lose a lot of money, Chicago, for example, they record all their interrogations as well. Note that Lassiter and his colleagues in 2009 found that when the camera is focused on the suspect, observers are more likely to judge the confession as voluntary, compared with the same confession reported from a different camera perspective. As you can see, the camera is up here, is up, and it's showing on the two interrogators, and the suspect is in the corner, and we can see the suspect's face. So as far as this camera angle is concerned, this is a good camera angle because we get to see everybody. And we get to hear what they're saying, and we get to see how they're acting. This case, not so much, or this is not as good. This does show the defendant, but as we can't see the face of the interrogator. However, some camera angles are really bad. Some camera angles only show the defendant, not the interrogator. If we just see the defendant, then the jury is not allowed to see the coercion of the interrogator. And of course, in these cases, they're more likely to convict the defendant if they don't see the interrogator. It's really kind of weird. And this is known as illusory causation. The tendency to attribute causation to one stimulus because it is more conspicuous than others. Since all we can do is hear the interrogators, we can't see what actions they're taking. All we can hear is what they're saying. And because of this, they're more likely to convict the defendant. When the recording shows both the suspect and the interrogator, observers are more attuned to situational pressures exerted by the interrogator, and they're less likely to convict the defendant. Another reform would be reconceptualize the fundamental nature of police interrogations. Researchers have found that non-confrontational United Kingdom type interviews produce fewer false confessions and more true confessions than accusatory interrogations. We see, if you watch these shows on television, CSI, NCIS, whatever, if you watch these shows on television, you can see that the American way of doing things is a little bit more intimidating. If you've ever watched an English or British crime show, their way of interrogating is completely different from ours. It's more a conversation between two people. And of course, they're always filmed. They're always videotaped. Okay. That is okay. So let's go to court. Let's go to trial. There we go. Many criminal cases are simply dismissed for lack of evidence or other difficulties that prosecutors perceive in the case. As you can imagine, you need all of this information in order. You need lots of information. You need lots of proof that the individual actually committed a crime. I told you about my own case where they had very circumstantial evidence. The lady was dead, and it was all circumstantial evidence against me, but they built a case against me, as weird as that may sound, mainly because my bite was similar to the individual that bit the lady after he murdered her. She was still alive, and because she was still alive, it swelled after he bit her. And since it swelled, they assumed that the size of the mouth was smaller than it actually was. I have a depressed tooth right here, and he bit her upside down, and they thought that somebody bit her right side up, as weird as that sounds. So his upper teeth were very similar to my lower teeth. That was primarily the only information that they had, was the bite mark. That was the only true evidence that they had. All the other evidence they had against me had to do with the fact that I played on the softball team, and we played softball right beside where the lady was murdered. And that's it. That's pretty much it. That and the fact that I was on base when the murder occurred. But that's it. That's all they had. They didn't have any proof. I don't know if they could have convicted me on that information. But as soon as the reality was, it was her estranged husband that was, or as the guy that was having an affair with her, that had murdered her because she had threatened to tell his wife. The two of them were having an affair. She was married to somebody else, and she was estranged from that guy. But he was exonerated because his teeth he didn't have the same shape of teeth. But the individual that actually did murder her had very similar teeth to mine, except they were reversed. His upper teeth looked like my bottom teeth, and his bottom teeth looked like my upper teeth. We had an underbite like this. I don't have an overbite, but okay. So sometimes you can put a case together, despite the fact that there isn't enough evidence to convict. For the vast majority of people charged with crimes fortunate enough to have charges dropped, plea bargains, not trials, resolve the case. So if we have somebody that's a drug dealer, what they will normally do is pile on. They'll charge them with as many things as they possibly can. When my wife and I were in the military, one of the things that we noticed was whenever she was in a court-martial, since she was an officer, she got to go to court-martials all the time. And whenever she was in a court-martial, it seemed like they charged me with anything that they could come up with. So they had one case where, all this has to do with sex. I apologize for that. They had one case where a guy was having sex with somebody else's wife. Well, that's adultery. That's adultery, because one of them was married. Actually, both of them were married. So that was adultery. But they not only charged them with adultery and fornication, but they also charged them with sodomy, which I found a little odd. How do they know how they had sex? But that's what they did. They charged them with as many things as they possibly could. And the reason they did that is so that they could plea bargain. So they would say, okay, we're going to convict you, but we'll throw out, two of the charges. We'll convict you of adultery, but we'll throw out sodomy and rape, that kind of thing. Of course, if it's rape, they'd have to throw them in prison instead of kick them out of the service. But they would plea bargain, and usually it's because they were charged with so many things. And if they were actually convicted of all those charges, they would have gone to prison for an extended length of time. But since they were plea bargaining, they plea bargained down to one charge of adultery or whatever, fornication maybe. It's really kind of weird. Plea bargaining is a process in which the defendant agrees to plead guilty in exchange for some concession from the prosecutor. Usually it's a reduction in type of charge, the number of charges, or in recommended sentencing. The prosecutor can usually recommend how many years in prison the guy should go to prison. Now the judge doesn't have to accept what the prosecutor says. They can do anything that they want. The judge, of course, is in charge, but the prosecutor, of course, will suggest what should happen. By pleading guilty, the defendants give up their right to a trial. They can't go to trial after this. They have pled guilty. Now they are a felon, so they lose their right to carry a firearm in most states. They lose the right to vote in most states. Most civil cases are resolved without a trial in a process called settlement negotiation. And if you know anything about Donald Trump and you've read about his history, he's in court almost all the time. This is probably the longest time he's ever not been in court because he can't be sued as president of the United States. He's declared bankruptcy 3 times. He's in court literally all the time. If somebody does something for him, they put in a marble staircase or something, and they charge him $1 million, he won't pay them, and then they go to court, and either they plea bargain so that he pays the guy only a fraction of what he was charged, or he doesn't have to pay at all, because he could drag this thing out in court for an extended length of time. I told you the story of Bell Telephone, didn't I? Bell Telephone used to own all of the long-distance lines in the United States. And so that they wouldn't be a monopoly, they had to allow other telephone companies to exist. But they had to allow other telephone companies to tie into their long-distance lines. But they charged those companies to tie into their long-distance lines. So they could charge them higher rates. So if you were on a Bell line and you wanted to call long distance, it might cost you 10 cents a minute for long distance. If you were one of these auxiliary telephone companies, then they would charge you $1.20 to connect to the long distance line, and then they would charge you 20 cents or 30 cents a minute. It was a huge ripoff. Well, as it turned out, the Bell Telephone decided that they weren't going to service any military installations. So all the military installations, in order to have telephone service, had to have their own telephone companies. And of course, everything was long distance. Everything was long distance from the base to wherever you wanted to call, unless you were calling someplace else on base. So we've got all these military installations all over the United States, and the GIs, the military people, were paying out through the nose to call anybody. They couldn't call off base because it cost them an arm and a leg to do that. So eventually somebody sued Bell Telephone, and Bell Telephone lost. And then it went to an appeals court, and they lost again. And then it went to another appeals court, and they lost again. And they just kept losing all over the country. And so at one point they decided that and of course they never paid any money because they kept appealing. And you have the right to do that. You can do that. And that's what Trump does. If he loses in a court case, he just appeals it. And he keeps dragging these things out. Well, not everybody has all the money in the world to hire a lawyer to go to court for an extended length of time. He did. Bell Telephone certainly did. So they drug this thing out. I was part of a lawsuit from Lubbock, Texas. I had a $1,200 telephone bill 1 month. I was making like $5,000 a year, and I had a $1,200 telephone bill. It was because my wife had left and she went home to Indiana and she kept calling, not just long distance, but she kept reversing the charges. Now, as it turns out, reversing the charges, they can charge you more money for that. As stupid as that sounds. I know. It was a racket, let me tell you. So I was part of a lawsuit when we sued Bell Telephone. This is in 1973. They didn't settle the case until 1991. They finally settled the case in 1991. Well, I could have been dead by then. Well, everybody could have been dead. It was a bunch of military guys that sued the government, or that sued Bell Telephone, and by that time they had broken up Bell Telephone, and that's how they got out of the lawsuit. They didn't have to pay anything because they broke up their monopoly and they became AT&T. That's when they became AT&T. They were Bell Telephone before that. And there were four first they broke up into Bell Telephones. There was Southern Bell, and there was California Bell, and there was Bell Telephone was in the Northeast. And then the Midwest had their own Bell Telephone. Anyway, they broke up. And then eventually, of course, they broke up again. And because of their long distance lines, Sprint sued them because they charged them extra money for their long distance lines. Now, none of this makes any difference to you guys. You can call anybody you want. You can use Sprint, you can use AT&T, you can use all of these different long distance carriers because it's all satellite now. It's all satellite. Back then it was all online, as stupid as that sounds. Anyway, okay, so they can negotiate. And unfortunately, the biggest problem that they have is the fact that they can appeal and they don't have to pay any money. So all these settlements you see, there was just recently there was a settlement where the guy got $256 million. It turns out that he's not going to get $256 million. For one thing, this is never going to be settled. And nobody's ever going to see any of that money because it's a big corporation and they can draw it out as long as they want. So just because you win a case doesn't mean you're ever going to get anything. If the police believe that a suspect committed a crime, they will probably arrest the suspect. That's what works. If they arrest the suspect, he knows he's arrested when they read him his Miranda Rights. If they arrest him, they can hold him for 2 days. They can hold him for 48 hours. And this is one of the reasons why they don't do that. That's if they do arrest him and they can't charge him with anything, then potentially he can sue for false arrest. But if they have a suspect and it looks like he's actually guilty, then they can arrest him and they can hold him for 2 days before they charge him with anything. Charging implies a formal decision to continue with the prosecution, and that decision is made by the prosecuting attorney rather than the police. So the police arrest somebody, they read him his Miranda rights, then they have to go to the district attorney to find out if he's actually going to be tried. Because only the district attorney can try somebody. The police, it's completely out of their hands. So if the district attorney decides that he's not going to prosecute any more marijuana cases, then it would be silly for the police to arrest people for possession of marijuana.
So if somebody, okay, you said they have 2 days to hold him, and is that 2 days, is that based on them seeing the judge for their charges? If
He has to
they're
see the
incarcerated?
judge. He has to see the judge within 2 days. Within
Is that
48
in
hours.
every state?
That's federal law.
Okay.
Okay, so every state has to follow that law. So they have to see the judge as soon as possible. Now, sometimes if they arrest somebody, they'll see the judge the next morning. They'll only spend eight hours in jail or 4 hours in jail. It all depends on the lawyer. If the lawyer has an in with the judge, then the judge will see the case right away. If he has no lawyer, then potentially they'll draw it out as long as they possibly can. So he'll have to spend 48 hours in jail. This is where rich people and poor people aren't treated equally under the law. If you're somebody that's wealthy and you have a good lawyer, then he'll get you out of jail within a number of hours. because he'll take it to the judge, and he will demand that the judge see the case. If it's a poor person and they don't have a lawyer, who's going to force the judge to look at the case? So it's the prosecuting attorney that decides whether somebody's going to be tried for something. So if we have policemen that are arresting people on circumstantial evidence, and the district attorney or the prosecuting attorney can't find any reason to hold the individual because the case is too weak, then they're going to have to let the guy go. That's the way it works. Even if they are pretty damn sure that this is the guy that actually did it, it really doesn't make any difference. They have to be able to take it to a court of law and win the case in order for them to hold the individual for an extended length of time. The Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution requires that any person arrested be brought before a judge within 48 hours of the arrest, and this is one of the reasons why if somebody murders somebody and they get arrested, you see pictures of them going to court. Usually you don't see them going to court. It's usually by closed-circuit television that they go to court. So you'll see a picture of them. And of course, this is all public information. As long as they're not a juvenile, then they can be shown to the public, and they can mention their names. Most states will not disclose the information of a juvenile offender, only of adult offenders. So if it's a 17-year-old that raped somebody, they won't. His name will never appear in the newspaper, and of course they can't talk about it on television. The judge reviews the evidence, and sometimes if like four guys do something wrong, and two of them are juveniles and two of them are adults, or two of them are 18 years old and two of them are 17 years old, the two that are 17-year-old, we never find out what their names are. But the two guys that are 18 years old, they mention their names and they show their pictures on television. The judge reviews the evidence summarized by the prosecutor and determines whether there is reason to believe that the suspect committed the crimes charged. So they have to have evidence. And if they have hard evidence, if they have good evidence, then potentially the judge will decide that they can go to trial. If the judge decides there's not enough evidence to convict, then he'll throw the case out, in which case that will let the guy go. They can only hold him for 48 hours. And if, of course, the lawyer is able to get into court before 48 hours, that's as long as they can hold the guy. The judge will inform defendants of the charges against them, inform them of their constitutional rights, review the issue of bail, and appoint attorneys for those that cannot afford to hire their own. The judge does this the first time he sees him. He asks him if he has enough money, or if he has a lawyer. If he doesn't have a lawyer, he asks him if he has enough money to hire a lawyer. If he doesn't, then he will appoint a court-appointed lawyer. Now, who does this lawyer work for? He works for the state. Doesn't work for the county, he's paid by the state. That's usually the way it works. This is normally this will be an individual that is a relatively new lawyer. He's not very experienced. Very rarely will they have an appointed lawyer that has years of experience. It just doesn't usually work that way. The prosecution must offer some evidence on every element of the crime charged, and the judge must decide whether the evidence is sufficient to pursue the case further. It's the judge's decision as to whether what's going to happen next. No jury is present, and defendants rarely testify or offer any evidence of their own. So this is kind of a slam dunk as far as the police are concerned. This is their opportunity to present evidence, or actually it's the prosecuting attorney. He's the one that provides the evidence, and the defendant can't present any evidence at all. This is kind of a slam dunk for these individuals, and since this is the case, a lot of times they will be convicted at that point. Not convicted, but they will be remanded to trial. because there is no defense attorney unless the guy has lots of money. If the guy has lots of money, then the defending attorney is usually allowed to speak in front of the judge. That's usually the way it works. But it all depends on the state. New York State allows that. California allows that, and because of that, and because most of our television comes out of either New York or California, that's what we see, and we assume that that's the way it is in every state. But it isn't that way. In most of the southern states, the attorney for the defendant isn't allowed to speak. All he can do is, after he is remanded to trial, then he can speak to the judge. The judge will sometimes send the case to a grand jury or reduce the charges, either because he or she believes the evidence does not support the level of crime charged by the prosecutor or because of a plea bargain. So a lot of times the judge will change what's going on as far as the police are concerned. They want to charge the guy with first-degree murder, and the judge will say, I don't see enough evidence to show that he planned this murder, therefore I'm going to reduce the charges to manslaughter. That kind of thing happens from time to time. Popular Penn State coach Jerry Sandusky was able to avoid prosecution in Happy Valley, and actually that's where Penn State is, it's in Happy Valley. As weird as that sounds. Until a 2-year grand jury investigation. It took him 2 years to decide to prosecute this guy, even though they had all this evidence against him. What was going on? Well, what was going on was the football coach, Joe Paterno, 95-year-old Joe Paterno, didn't want to lose Jerry Sandusky. Joe Paterno lost his job because he covered up the fact that this guy was molesting young boys. He had a football camp, and he would target select individuals at that football camp in the summertime. They still allowed him to use Penn State facilities in his football camp, despite the fact that there was lots of information that this guy was molesting young boys. And this went on for years. Well, from 94 to 2009, it went on for 15 years. And everybody knew, well, not everybody knew, of course. There were enough people that knew. And it took them 2 years before they could bring it before the judge, before the grand jury. The grand jury had to investigate for 2 years. He was charged with 52 counts of deviant sexual intercourse, endangering the welfare of a child, indecent assault, the rape of several young boys between 1994 and 2009. 52 counts. He is serving 30 to 60 years in prison. He'll probably die in prison. And there's it would be very strange for him to be allowed parole, despite the fact he was a favored coach with Joe Paterno. And of course, Penn State football is everything at Penn State. But he's in jail now, and he will never get out. Consisting of citizens, the grand jury consists of citizens drawn from the community. The grand jury meets in private with the prosecutor to investigate criminal activity and returns indictments, complaints prepared by the prosecutor describing the crime charged. So you'll hear about grand jury cases. They're starting to investigate Rudy Giuliani. The reason Rudy Giuliani's in so much trouble right now is because a grand jury has been investigating him. The FBI and the grand jury has been investigating him for 2 years. For what is it? Are they charging him? There's a lot of things that he seems to be doing, and none of them seem to be legal. He received $500,000 from the 2 guys that were just arrested. Actually, they've arrested 4 of his cronies. And it looks like those guys are probably going to go to jail. But Giuliani is kind of in trouble right now. And of course, he was the one that Trump mentioned 8 times in that telephone conversation to the president of the Ukraine. The grand jury may call witnesses if it is dissatisfied with the witnesses presented by the prosecutor. In some states, the defendant has a right to testify. Grand juries are really kind of interesting. These are just citizens, and they start looking at criminal cases, and they have to decide whether these criminal cases should be indicted or not, whether somebody should have to go to court. Well, sometimes lawyers seem a little bit squirrely, even prosecuting attorneys. So in most states, grand juries have the right to call any witness that they want. The prosecuting attorney doesn't have to be part of it. So they can go against the prosecuting attorney, as interesting as that is. So anytime anytime a case goes to the grand jury, now all bets are off, because the law isn't really controlling, can't control the grand jury. So whatever deal has been made by the prosecuting attorney or by attorneys, by the judges, it doesn't really matter. The grand jury can indict anybody that they want. They're free to do whatever they want. In about 1/3 of the states, a criminal defendant cannot be prosecuted unless a grand jury has found grounds to do so. In some states, they only have grand juries. The judge doesn't get to decide what cases go to court. The grand juries decide. The remaining states permit the prosecutor to proceed either by grand jury indictment or by a preliminary hearing, and the preliminary hearing is, of course, in front of a judge. If the grand jury decides there is sufficient evidence to justify the defendant being tried, it issues an indictment, and of course, a grand jury indictment is fairly serious. That means it's outside the system. It's outside the legal system. The grand jury has indicted somebody. At the arraignment, the judge makes sure that the defendant has an attorney. The defendant is asked to plead guilty or not guilty, and almost always they plead not guilty, no matter how much evidence there is against them. If they plead guilty, it's all over with. They pled guilty to a crime, and now they will be sentenced. If they plead not guilty, it will go to trial. There's always a possibility that you can win it in a trial, that some of the evidence will be thrown out, that it won't be as bad if you go to trial. And that's the reason why hardly anybody pleads guilty, even if they are guilty. We're talking about the law here. We're not talking about the truth. We're talking about the law. And the law is completely different from reality. The judge makes a decision, the jury makes a decision. Sometimes the judge won't allow select pieces of evidence. That's what happened in the Manafort case. The federal government thought they had a really heavy, they charged him with 18 different things. They thought they were going to get him on at least 16, but the judge wouldn't allow some of the evidence to be presented during trial. 18 charges, he was only convicted of 8 of them. So they had to throw 10 of them out as it were. It is customary for defendants to plead not guilty at this time in order to provide opportunities both for discovery, the defendant's attorney can review some of the evidence against the defendant, and for plea bargaining. And of course, this is when the plea bargain comes in. They will never go to trial. They will plea bargain down. So if the guy's charged with rape and murder, they'll throw out the rape charge, or they'll throw out the murder charge and just convict him of rape. Defendants and their attorneys want to be aware of the evidence the prosecution will use to prove its case. In civil cases, each side is entitled to discovery. In other words, whatever evidence they have against the individual has to be given to the prosecutor has to give their evidence, and the defendant has to give their evidence. so that they are aware of what evidence is out there. Each side can question the other side's witnesses and the review documents that the other side might use at trial. If you watch these things on television, usually there's a surprise. There's always a surprise just before the end of the trial. And because of that surprise, now all of a sudden the defendant is either convicted or they're allowed they're let go. This doesn't usually happen. Judges don't usually allow new pieces of evidence to come forward. If the police have a case, they're not going to continue investigating the case. They're going to close the case if it goes to trial. So they're not out there looking for new evidence. It's just not the way it works. The police have too much to do to be wandering around looking for new evidence in a case that is already in trial. It just doesn't happen. And of course, the defense attorney normally comes up with a strategy that he's going to use or she's going to use during the trial. And they're not looking for new information either. It's only on television that they're looking for new information. So it just doesn't happen. It doesn't usually happen. But it's a good way of making an exciting television show. Criminal cases, what the prosecution must reveal to the defense varies. Most states require that only the prosecutor share evidence that is exculpatory. Exculpatory means that it's evidence that is against their prosecution. So if there's something that potentially would exonerate the defendant, that's the evidence that they have to give them. They have to give them all exculpatory evidence. Lawyers have gotten in trouble because they've hidden exculpatory evidence. They've got a case and it looks like they can win the case, but there's a little piece of evidence over here that says that this individual might not have actually committed the crime. Now, according to the law, they're supposed to disclose that information to the defense. But some lawyers will decide that they'll just hide that piece of evidence, or not talk about that piece of evidence, or they'll bury that piece of evidence in masses of information. Remember, this doesn't have anything to do with the truth. It has to do with the law. And if you're a lawyer, you get paid for winning, not for losing. So lawyers, sometimes, their ethics are not very high. So they have to disclose all exculpatory evidence. In many states, the defense is required to notify the prosecution if it intends to rely on insanity or alibi defenses. It all depends on the state. Like I said, there's not supposed to be any surprises in court. Most judges don't like surprises. They will punish the lawyer. They'll try to take his license away if he keeps pulling these things. So they have to disclose all their, in essence, what happens is the judge already has all the evidence. Now all it is the personalities of the two lawyers is going to decide what is going to happen with the defendant. But the judge already has all the evidence that they want or that they will accept. They can throw pieces of evidence out if they want, but they already have all this evidence. So they already have decided what is going to happen in the case. Normally, that's the way it works. Timothy Masters was just 15 years old when the body of a 37-year-old female was found near his trailer park in Fort Collins, Colorado. Timothy allowed police to search his room and school locker, and they found 2,200 pages of violently misogynistic writings and drawings and a collection of knives. Now remember, this is a 15-year-old boy, so he's just gone through puberty, and he's kind of sex is one of the things he thinks about, okay? So yes, he is a little bit misogynistic. No physical evidence was ever linked to Masters at the crime scene. She was stabbed a number of times, and that's how she died. He had knives, he had misogynistic writings. These are all pieces of circumstantial evidence. If they can't tie the knives to the wounds, then they really have no case. However, at trial, an expert witness, forensic psychologist, concluded without ever having spoken with Masters, that some of the drawings represented Masters reliving the crime. He had 2,200 pages of drawings of him murdering somebody. Although some of the jurors had doubts about his guilt, they convicted him based on his drawings and his writings. So he was convicted for being a 15-year-old jerk, writing misogynistic writings. There's Timothy Masters at 15, and there's the lady that was murdered. There's some of his writings, as you can see. He's using his sword to chop somebody in half. The devil is carrying around a machete. I don't know if you understand what a machete is. Machete isn't really tends not to be very sharp. They're very, very long knives. It's used as a chopping instrument. If somebody were to attack you with a machete, they would potentially, if they swung hard enough, they could do a lot of damage. But it's not a sharp instrument. It's just not sharp. So it's kind of a blunt force trauma wherever it hits. But it does cut, and it will cut through clothing. It's a really nasty way to go. If you wanted to chop somebody's head off, a machete would not be the instrument that you would want to use. You'd want to use something a little bit sharper than that. Anyway, that's a machete. Sometimes when we have massacres around the world, they'll use machetes. It's an ugly way to go. It's a very painful way to go because it's more of a bruising instrument than a cutting instrument. But it does have an edge to it. Anyway, this is a samurai sword. He's chopping this guy. This is a machete. And as you can see, those are his doodles. So he was convicted on being a jerk. Being a 15-year-old boy is what he was convicted of. Masters was released from prison after 9 years when DNA evidence exonerated him. He didn't do it. DNA showed it wasn't him, it was somebody else. A review of the case showed that investigators had a second suspect and they suppressed evidence to ensure the conviction. Remember, they have to disclose any exculpatory evidence, as if it might be somebody else. That would have been exculpatory evidence, but they suppressed it. So in collusion, the prosecutor and the investigators colluded to convict Timothy Masters of the crime. He wasn't, remember, it's not the truth, it's the law. We're not looking for the truth here, we're trying to follow the law, as weird as that sounds. Anyway, there's Timothy Masters. You can see he went bald at 9 years. I guess being in prison wasn't the most pleasant thing in the world.
And he was just 15?
He was 15 when he went to jail. They tried him as an adult.
So how old is he in that picture?
24.
Damn.
I know, he doesn't have any hair. During the discovery phase of the case, both sides filed pretrial motions seeking favorable rulings on the admissibility of evidence. So that what the defendant will do, they'll try to throw out all the evidence they possibly can. They'll try to move the trial someplace where they've never heard of this guy before. Motion to separate trials. So if two people are being tried, they want them to be tried separately. They don't want them to be tried together. If they're tried together, then both of them will hang together, unfortunately. But if we can separate the trials, possibly one individual will be convicted for the crime and another individual will be exonerated. I have a cousin. He's an idiot. He dropped out of school. He's really smart, but he dropped out of school, started hitchhiking across the country. He hitchhiked with this one guy, this salesman, and while somehow they got the guy out of the car, and then they ran over him and killed him. They ran over him and they kept backing over him and crushing his body. Anyway, they killed him. Threw him in the trunk of the car. And then they went home, of course. What else would you do? They killed him in Illinois, and then this was in Indiana. They put him in the trunk, and then they drove home. They drove back home to Muncie. So they decided that they were going to get rid of the car. I mean, that's fairly obvious evidence against them. Their fingerprints are all over the car. So they decided that they were going to drive the car into the reservoir. Okay. I don't know what they were thinking, but they drove it. This is Indiana. Indiana's just, it's an old swamp is what it is. But they drained the water, and now they've got farmland, which is really rich farmland, but it's still pretty damn muddy. Anyway, so they drive the car into the reservoir. Well, they ran into a patch of mud, and the car's sitting out of the water. I mean, it's not completely immersed in the water. They try to drive it, and of course the engine floods because it's underwater. The wheels are spinning because it's digging into clay. They're just dumb as dirt. Anyway, so what happens next? Somebody sees the car in the reservoir, and they go and they pull the car out of the reservoir to get rid of it, for one thing. They open the trunk, and there's the dead body. Now, this is my cousin. My cousin was 16 at the time. And he was a college dropout, or he was a high school dropout. The other guy was 17. So it's a 16-year-old and 17-year-old. So he decides he's going to run to Ohio, because Ohio doesn't extradite juveniles. Indiana will execute a juvenile. That's the way Indiana plays. And they will try him, they would have tried him as an adult. So he decides he's going to run away to Ohio. And he's safe in Ohio because Ohio will not extradite him back to Indiana. So he's safe in Ohio. He's only 16 years old. He stays in Ohio for a couple of years, and in the meantime, the other guy who has just turned 18 has gone to trial, and he has implicated my cousin as the murderer. So this is how smart my cousin is. He goes back to Indiana, of course, to visit. Well, you know who he went to visit. Did he go to visit his mother? No. Did he go to visit his father? No. He went to visit his girlfriend. As dumb as this is. Who's not even his girlfriend anymore, okay? I mean, it's been a year and a half since this guy has fled to Ohio. She's not even his girlfriend anymore. So he goes back to visit his ex-girlfriend, and of course she turns him in because she's scared of him. So she turns him in, he gets arrested, now he's 18. He could be tried as an adult. He could have been tried as an adult before. But now he's an 18-year-old, so he goes to trial, and of course he gets convicted of murder, a first-degree murder he gets tried, and so he's put in jail for 45 to 60 years. He's out now, don't worry. Don't worry, it's a happy story. He's out.
How did that happen? How did he get out if he was sentenced to 45 to 60 years?
Usually you get parole in 20, 25 years. That's the way it works.
Even though the judge puts that sentence in place? Because wouldn't it be the minimum of 45 years?
No. 45 to 60 years means that either 45 is the maximum or 60 years is the maximum. So he only spent 20 years in prison. He actually spent 19 years in prison. Yeah. His dad is my first cousin, so he's my second cousin. But he's out of jail now. No, he's not. They convicted him of rape. It was statutory rape. He was messing around with somebody that was underage. He's an idiot. Well, I told you he was an idiot. I mean, he dropped out of school at 16, just like his dad. He wanted to be just like his dad.
After a while, it just is, you just kind of get used to being incarcerated to where you don't even know how to
be outside
in the real world.
Yeah. I don't think that was his case. That was his situation. He was too smart to work.
Uh-huh.
Okay, you've met people like that.
Yes.
Yeah, they go on welfare and they think that they're scoring off the federal government or off the county or the state. And then they go and they say, oh, I've got a back problem, I need to be disabled. And then they get more money, you know, they're just trying to score. That's the way this guy was. And of course, he started running around, and he was 16 when he went to, well, he was 18 when he went to jail, but he was 16 when he ran away from home. He's trying to hitchhike across. He only made it to Illinois. I mean, he didn't go that far, but he didn't want to work. He just wanted people to give him money because he's so damn smart. Yeah, he's real smart. Anyway, he's fun. He's back in jail now for statutory rape. How old is he? Wait a minute. I'm 70, so he'd be in his 50s, and here he is messing around, dating junior high girls, you know, that kind of stupid stuff. But then again, when he left Indiana, he was only 16 years old, so his brain stopped maturing at 16. So his brain still thinks he's 16 years old, even though he's been through all this crap. Anyway, okay, so what do? So everybody's trying to make the case as good as they possibly can. So what they try to do is change everything. They will have a motion for separate trials if there's more than one defendant. And that's what happened with my cousin. Motion to sever counts. In other words, they want to be tried. He not only wanted to be tried for murder, but they also wanted to try him for grand theft auto because they stole the car from the guy, and you know, and assault with a deadly weapon, you know, that kind of stuff. So they just kept piling on the charges, and he wanted to be tried. He wanted 3 separate trials. That's what's going. That's what happened with Manafort. Manafort was convicted of 8 different charges. But he has to go to court for something else. He's done all these different things. So they want to sever the counts so it doesn't look so bad. Now the reality is that when he went to trial, actually he went to trial for murder first. But when he went to trial for murder, they couldn't mention the fact that it was grand theft auto and it was assault with a deadly weapon. Those were separate trials. So they couldn't even mention that in the murder trial. And then when he was convicted of murder, they couldn't mention the fact that he was being tried for assault with a deadly weapon in his assault with a deadly weapon trial. As weird as that sounds. There's always a motion to change venue. If the newspapers in this area are talking about his case, of course, what's the probability you're going to be able to find somebody who has not already thought about the case and has tried and has convicted him in their own minds? So they try to change venue. If it's a state situation, the state of Arizona, somebody murdered somebody up here, they would probably try to get it changed to Yuma, because what's the probability that somebody in Yuma has heard about what's going on in Saley or Chinle or Ganado? They don't really care. So they would try to get it changed from Chinle to, actually this is federal, this would be a federal court, so that wouldn't really work. But in Holbrook, they would try to have it changed to Yuma or Tucson, someplace where they had never heard of this before. And a lot of times the judge won't allow it to happen. The judge will just keep it where it is. Motion to suppress a confession or other statements by the defendant. Defendants, a lot of the times, they'll get angry and they'll just start blabbing. And of course, all of this is admissible in court. That's what the Miranda Rights tell you. Anything that you say may be used in a court of law. Motions in limine is a request for a pretrial ruling, and of course that is what happens with all of these. So the defense will present all of their the inadmissibility, or they'll try to get everything changed, and so will the prosecution. And this is known as in limine. When there are two defendants, often one of the defendants will seek a separate trial for fear that being tied together will result in a prejudicial decision. That's what happened with the case with my cousin. The other guy who was actually the one driving the car, according to my cousin. It was the other guy's idea, and it was the other guy who was driving the car that ran back and forth over this guy. They flattened him pretty good. He looked like roadkill by the time they were done with him. They flattened him out pretty good. I know, and there's blood all over the place. I don't know what they were thinking. There's lots and lots of blood in the human body. And they ran back and forth over this guy just a bunch of times. It was just stupid. Anyway, according to my cousin, it was the other guy's idea. It was the other guy that did the driving, so that we wouldn't be afraid of him. And he was given probation, by the way. He was given probation. He dropped a dime on my cousin and he got probation. And he ended up in jail also, but he was a violent offender. So not only was he part of this crime, but he kept robbing things with a weapon. And eventually he discharged the weapon, and of course at that point they threw him in jail forever. Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, involved in the Oklahoma City bombing that killed 168 people, were tried separately. McVeigh, of course, was convicted of terrorism, and he was executed. And he was executed fairly quickly. This is Terry Nichols. This is where he built the bomb, at Terry Nichols' farm. Terry Nichols is in jail for life. He was not executed. However, if they had been tried together, then probably they would both have been executed. If a defendant is charged with multiple counts, they may choose to separate the charges and be tried in separate trials for each charge, and that's what happened with my cousin. This may reduce the prejudice created by some of the more onerous charges. They will also get separate juries, and of course, anytime you get a jury, sometimes they'll be favorable, sometimes they will be unfavorable. If you get a jury and it's all guys, men are kind of mean, a lot meaner than women tend to be, so you will probably, potentially the men will be meaner than the women are. And you just never know who you're going to get on a jury. The defendant may request a change of venue, moving the proceedings to another location, on the grounds that community opinion, usually the product of prejudicial pretrial publicity, makes it impossible to seat a fair-minded jury. And this, of course, was the case with the three defendants in the murder case of the 10-year-old girl that was raped and murdered and dismembered. And they tried to set her on fire. I don't know what they were thinking, starting a fire in a bathtub in an apartment building. I don't know how much sense that makes. We won't talk about how trying to burn a human body. It's not the easiest thing in the world. First of all, the body is wet. It won't burn. It's not like we're made out of oil or something. The skin burns fairly easily, but I mean the rest of the body is like trying to burn water. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense at all. It's not the easiest thing in the world. You need a really hot fire for that to happen. And here they are, they're starting a fire in a bathtub in an apartment building. And of course the smoke detector went off. I mean, it was just stupid. Psychologists are sometimes involved in analyzing the extent and the impact of the publicity on prospective jurors. And so that's something that psychologists do from time to time. The Fifth and Sixth Amendments protect Americans from self-incrimination and the use of a statement taken without benefit of counsel. Often a motion will be filed to suppress statements made by defendants, including a confession that a judge will have to rule on before a trial can proceed. So sometimes the judge will throw out the confession, in which case the confession cannot be mentioned during the trial, theoretically. If it is mentioned, then the judge will censure the attorney. But if the guy confesses, and the jury hears that he actually confessed, despite the fact they're not supposed to know that he confessed, then they're more likely to convict, as weird as that sounds. Or it doesn't sound that weird at all, I guess. But the judge will censure the attorney. So a lot of times what will happen is you'll have more than one attorney. You'll have the lead attorney, then you'll have a subordinate attorney. And it'll be the subordinate that gets thrown out of court. He's the one that mentions the fact that there was a confession. As if, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot that I wasn't supposed to say that. But once the jury hears something, of course, it's impossible for the jury to unhear something. Motions in limina at the start are merely pretrial motions that set limits on the evidence that will be allowed during proceedings. Now, you would think that this is going to take forever. If we have all of these court cases that we have to try that are going to court, it's going to take forever. But it doesn't, because 90 to 95% of all cases are plea bargaining. They never go to court. Trump has never been in court. Doesn't have to go to court. He plea bargains. And one of the things that he plea bargains, that he always puts in just about everything that he does, is that you're not allowed to disclose any of the information of the plea bargain. That's part of it. So he's got all of these cases, and nobody can find out anything about these cases because everybody has been censured. They cannot say anything about the trial, about the court case. He has plea bargained. And whether he wins or loses, he claims that he always wins. But we can't ever find out because nobody's allowed to talk about it. It's the way it works. Remember, it doesn't have anything to do with the truth, it has to do with the law. The law says that nobody can say anything. That's one of the reasons why he didn't want his taxes revealed. Now, of course, they're going to be revealed. This may go to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court rarely hears cases where taxes are involved. So they'll throw it out. They won't even see the case, in which case it goes back to the appeals court. While these motions are usually filed by the defendant to suppress select pieces of information, they also are used by prosecutors to determine the range of acceptable evidence. So a lot of times, well, let's say they took my case to trial. If I had a lawyer, my lawyer would probably say, can we prove that it was his teeth that made those marks? And of course the judge would say, no, we can't prove it. Then they'd say, well, I think we need to suppress that piece of evidence. It's right by your foot. It's rolling, okay. As stupid as that sounds. Judges must decide whether to keep trial on criminal defendants in custody between arrest and trial, or whether to release them with a promise to reappear for later hearings. Judges can deny bail. For example, if a defendant is a flight risk. This is what happened with Jeffrey Epstein. He owned an island in the Bahamas. He had 2 jet airplanes. This was the Southern District of New York, was trying him. He has a home in Miami. He has a home in Europe. He has homes all over the world. If he had been able to escape, potentially he could have stayed away from prosecution. If he never came back to the United States again, he could have stayed away from prosecution. In the case of the individuals that were arrested with Rudy Giuliani, the first 2 were seized when they came back to the United States. They are American citizens, but they were born in Ukraine. They used to call it the Ukraine when it was part of the Soviet Union. Now they call it Ukraine because it's its own country. That's the mistake that people keep making. Anyway, so there's 4 of them, and the other 2 people when they came back to the United States were arrested by the federal government. But some people are flight risks, and Jeffrey Epstein was a flight risk, and they were afraid. They denied him bail, and after they denied him bail, and he saw that he wasn't going to be able to get away, like he did before down in Florida, that he wasn't going to get the sweetheart deal that he got in Florida, he committed suicide. Or did he? Or did somebody murder him in his jail cell? Would he have tried to turn state's evidence against his buddy, Donald Trump? Donald Trump. I know. This is a conspiracy theory that we don't really need to even talk about. Levi thinks it's funny, but it's not, okay? This is what they used to do with Hillary Clinton. They used to come up with all these conspiracy theories. Was Jeffrey Epstein murdered? Well, we have to assume that he committed suicide. Require that money be deposited with the court. This is a bail bondsman. If you've ever had anything to do with the court, and they weren't going to try you right away, of course they never try you right away, then you probably don't want to spend the next 2 or 3 months in jail, so you will bail yourself, you will be bailed out. And you can go to a bail bondsman. Now what happens is they will say, we're going to hold this person for, somebody just was arrested at, 2 guys shot, 2 brothers, this was in Ohio, I think. 2 brothers shot this guy in a road rage situation, and they shot him 3 times. So they're out on bail now, $75,000. But of course, if they charge you $75,000 bail, you only have to pay $7,500, and that $7,500 you will lose if you do not show up to court. So the bail bondsman will lend you the money, but then you have to show up to court. And if you don't show up to court, then he's out the $7,500. But when you come back to court, then you will owe the court $75,000. And of course, that's not bail money. That's $75,000 you have to pay to the court for fleeing, as interesting or strange as that is. Require that a third person be responsible for the defendant's future appearances. And of course, that can be your relative, it can be anybody. Or they can release you to your own recognizance, which means that you have to show up to court. Okay, why don't we stop right here? We'll pick this up next time. As much fun as talking about all these horrible